You ready? 3, yep, 2, 1.
All right, guys, welcome back to another episode of the Atheniano Show. I'm joined here with Filip Karaivanov. And we do many things on this show, but one of the things that we tend to do regularly, or that has become regular, is reading an analysis of the Gospels, and in particular, the Gospel of Matthew. So, Philip has been on for 3 of them now?
Think so, yeah.
Yeah, 3 of them. And we're going to start today with Matthew chapter 21 and hopefully finish it. We may not get to it. We may have to split it up into 2, but that is the goal. So if you've seen the other episodes, you know the way it's going to work. We're going to read, stop at certain points, talk about it, and continue like so. Philip is a theology student, so he knows way more than me. So I will defer to you, Philip,
Okay.
if
I'll
need be.
Try to live up to that.
So yeah, obviously, like and subscribe if you enjoy this video, and let's begin. So chapter 21, Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. When they had come near Jerusalem and had reached Bethphage at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 disciples, saying to them, "Go into the village ahead of you, and immediately you will find a donkey, tied, and a colt with her. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, just say this: 'The Lord needs them,' and he will send them immediately." This took place to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet. "Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." The disciples went and did as Jesus had directed them. They brought the donkey and the colt and put their cloaks on them, and he sat on them. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, and others cut branches from the trees and spread them on the road. The crowds that went ahead of him and that followed were shouting, "Hosanna to the Son of David! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord! Hosanna is the highest heaven!" When he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was in turmoil, asking, "Who is this?" The crowds were saying, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee." Jesus cleanses the temple. Then Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who were selling and buying in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. He said to them, "It is written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer,' but you are making it a den of robbers." The blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he cured them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the amazing things that he did, and heard the children crying out of the temple, saying, "Hosanna to the highest, to the Son of David," they became angry and said to him, "Do you hear what these are saying?" Jesus said to them, "Yes. Have you never read? Out of the mouths of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise for yourself." He left them, went out of the city to Bethany, and spent the night there. Jesus curses the fig tree. In the morning, when he returned to the city, he was hungry, and seeing a fig by the side of the tree, he went to it and found nothing at all but leaves. Then he said to it, "May no fruit ever come from you again." And the fig tree withered at once. When the disciples saw it, they were amazed, saying, "How did the fig tree wither at once?" Jesus answered them, "Truly I tell you, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only will you do what has been done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, 'Be lifted up and thrown into the sea,' it will be done. Whatever you ask for in prayer with faith, you will receive." I think this is a good place to stop. I want to talk more about the cleansing of the temple, because I think this is a really interesting um, scene, because I think a common portrayal of Jesus, people who haven't really read the gospel, right, is he's this, kumbaya,
Right.
love the neighbor, don't get mad at him, don't get angry at him. Uh, everything's, peaceful and great. But this is a scene where he really gets angry and turns everything upside down.
Yeah, I think we talked about this before when we talked about Sodom and Gomorrah, and where he talks about the cities and how the cities who have rejected him will be worse off than the biblical cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. So it's definitely something that we see often with him, that he's not a meek character, right? He has principles that he stands by, and that's part of being a morally virtuous person.
Mm.
So I think that's what we see here. And it's interesting that he says, so the idea that the temple is for prayer, right? That's what I noted. So it's about looking up, it's about looking to the divine, and it's not about looking down to our earthly means and our earthly possessions, right? So that's why he's saying this is not the proper place to be dealing with money, right? To be dealing with our own interests. This is a place to look higher up, right? So everything has its proper place, and then at the center of the religion is, right, the temple, and then the proper place for the temple is actually to look up. And in the Jewish tradition, there's actually an even more central place, which is the holiest of holies, right? The center of the room where God resides, right? Where he is more present than not. And that obviously does not mean that God is not omnipresent, but the idea is that there are certain places where his energy is felt more, and that people can call on that energy. And of course, this goes into later Christian tradition with the role of the church.
Mm. I also think it's quite interesting. I don't know what your translation says, but for me, it says that it's Jesus cleanses the temple, right? So how does he cleanse the temple? He drove out all who were selling and buying in the temple. He overturned the tables and the seats. So he basically
Gets really angry.
But like he cleansed, that's like him cleansing it, is like turning
Right.
everything upside down.
My one doesn't say anything about cleansing.
Mm.
It just says he enters the temple.
Oh. Or maybe that's just unique to my translation. But I do think it's an interesting idea, and it shows a different side of Jesus than I think a lot of people are used to, and also maybe shows his human side.
Yeah, well, that's another big thing that we talked about before when we talked about the transfiguration, that whilst it is trying to talk about his divinity, it is also equally trying to emphasize his humanity. But yeah, I think here we have a classic case of what we'd call like righteous wrath, right? That these things at their proper place, and this goes back to what we said about proper place, right? So everything has its own proper place. So like anger, for example, and wrath obviously has been treated as a sinful thing in the church, but it's related to when it's being used, right? So this is the proper place to be angry, right? Is when people are doing something unjust, right? So that's when you actually should be angry. So yeah, that's why I think the main point of the story is that everything has its proper right place. I did want to mention just that we do have again this continuance, so everything's connected. We have the talk about the Old Testament and how Jesus is fulfilling the Old Testament prophecy, like we mentioned at the beginning, to do with the Matthew Gospel, that it's directed towards a Jewish audience.
Good point.
And then we also have children again, which we talked about
Yes,
before.
that is, it's true. These themes you see keep on coming back. Yeah, for sure. I mean, even like the very beginning of Matthew is directly about Jesus fulfilling the prophecy with the lineage. So spot on there. All right, should we continue?
Yeah.
Okay. The authority of Jesus questioned. When he entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him as he was teaching and said, "By what authority are you doing these things? And who gave you this authority?" And Jesus said to them, "I will also ask you one question if you tell me the answer. Then I will also tell you by what authority I do these things." Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin?" And they argued with one another, "If we say from heaven, he will say to us, 'Why then did you not believe him?' But if we say of human origin, we are afraid of the crowd, for all regard John as a prophet." So they answered Jesus, "We do not know." And he said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things." The parable of the two sons. What do you think? A man had two sons. He went to the first and said, "Son, go and work in the vineyard today." He answered, "I will not." But later he changed his mind and went. The father went to the second and said the same. He answered, "I go, sir." But he did not go. Which of the two did the will of his father? They said, "The first." Jesus said to them, "Truly I tell you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are going into the kingdom of the kingdom of God ahead of you. For John came to you in the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him. But the tax collectors and the prostitutes believed him. And even after you saw it, you did not change your minds and believe him." The parable of the wicked tenants. Listen to another parable. There was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a winepress in it, and built a watchtower. Then he leased it to tenants and went away. When the harvest time had come, he sent his slaves to the tenants to collect his produce. But the tenants seized his slaves and beat one, killed another, and stoned another. Again he sent other slaves, more than the first, and they treated them in the same way. Then he sent his son to them, saying, "They will respect my son." But when the tenants saw the son, they said to themselves, "This is the heir. Come, let us kill him and get his inheritance." So they seized him and threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. Now when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do to those tenants? They said to him, "He will put those wretches to a miserable death and lease the vineyard to other tenants who will give him the produce at the harvest time." Jesus said to them, "Have you never read in the scriptures, 'The stone that the builder rejected has become the cornerstone'? This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people that produces its fruits. The one who falls on this stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls." When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard his parables, they realized that he was speaking about them. They wanted to arrest him, but they feared the crowds because they regarded him as a prophet.
So we can talk a little bit about this clash that comes here between Jesus and the Pharisees, because this is what's happening now in the city, and we see the way this ends here with the Pharisees being afraid of the crowds. This is mirroring what was just said about John the Baptist. Right, so Jesus says that they can't say that John the Baptist is not from heaven, right? Because the crowds will get upset because they thought he was a prophet, and now the same occurs with Jesus, that the Pharisees don't want to say anything directly against him.
Can you help me understand the reasoning in when he says, like, they say, "Oh, if we answer," I don't totally understand the John the Baptist part when the Pharisees say, "Well, if we say from human origin, we are afraid of the crowd, for all regard John as prophet. And if we say from divine origin, he will say to us, 'Why then did you not believe him?'"
So the way I see it here is that Jesus is kind of showing his cleverness, because I don't remember if it's before or after, but there is this moment where the Pharisees try and trap him in a similar rhetorical dilemma where they set up two alternatives, both are not good for him, and then he gets out of that rhetorical dilemma by giving a third original answer, which is normally how you get out of these dilemmas.
Mm-hmm.
And I think here is just showing that he can basically do the same thing as them, and be just as good as rhetoric as them,
Mhm.
because he stumps them, basically. He puts them in a dilemma, and then apparently they didn't have an answer for this, right? They didn't have any way of getting out of it, because it would just have like bad repercussions for them. So I think this is just mainly showing the skill and ability of Jesus to, as an orator and as someone who can actually defend his position.
I see. And what about the parable of the tenants? Do you have anything to say?
Well, the main thing I took from this is it's a prediction of what's going to happen later in the gospel with the death of Jesus, right? So we're continuing seeing throughout his life him predicting what's going to happen at the end, which is going to make what's going to happen in the end more forceful for the disciples, because they have seen him have foresight of what's going to happen.
So who is like, who are the Pharisees in this parable? Do you think? Is it the tenants?
Yeah, they're the ones who act against the son, right? That's sent. So it's interesting because you have this idea that the tenants, so the tenants, or like he sends his son first, and then the idea is that the son would be the one that's going to be respected and honored, but then actually the opposite happens, because he becomes the biggest target, right? So we see here this idea that when you're the highest thing, you're also the biggest target, right? So
Yeah.
this, everybody knows this, obviously, but it's interesting because a lot of people are naive about that, and they think that, well, why don't you just, why doesn't, for example, the son just come? Like, I've heard a lot of arguments where people talk about the divine, and it's kind of like, if, for example, there's a lot of arguments about miracles where there's this idea that if God simply shows himself to people, then people will believe automatically, right?
Yeah.
But here we see that this is claiming that, well, okay, but like, what if he sends his son to the people, right? And you would expect the reaction to be immediate belief and honor, but it's not. That's not the reaction of the people. So I think what we're seeing here is just human nature, and that people are more complicated than simply you show them a miracle, you show them the divine, and they believe their senses and they believe everything that occurs. So I actually see a connection here between that and arguments about miracles, and it's related to this problem of divine hiddenness, which is about, why is the divine hidden from us? Why is it not obvious? And again, we have this idea that it's obvious to the extent that you're ready to receive it, right? So if you're open to it, then it's obvious. But if you're looking for it as a target, like the tenants are here with the son, then it's not obvious to you, right? Then it becomes hidden from you. So that's something that I think is related here.
Interesting.
And that's also related to the previous conversation we had about, I think it was in the last podcast, where we were talking about the Pharisees always asking for a sign of authority from Jesus, and him never giving it to them. So there we have the divine hiddenness immediately present, right? Where like, and we see that he can do the miracles, right? So it's really weird, and it's also put in a way where they question his authority almost always right after he does a miracle. And even here, we just had the fig tree.
Right.
And then right afterwards, they question his authority again, right? So just now he did something to show his believers his power, his divinity, right? And then he says that if you believe in me, you could even move mountains. And then the Pharisees come over and they're like, can you just show us something little? And then he's like, no. Right? And then he traps them in this dilemma. So I think this is basically an answer to why is the divine hidden. And basically that's it, because it's not deserving of observation from everyone, right? It's something like that. And we see here that even though that's true, there's also this idea that the son still comes to be observed by everyone, right? So even despite better knowledge and knowing that it's going to become a target, he still comes, and then obviously he becomes a target because the reaction is not what we would expect. Of course, the divine knows what the reaction will be, but a lot of people think, no, the reaction should be honoring the son because, this is the highest offering that we have, and then we see that the reaction is not that. The reaction is actually, if this is the highest offering we have, then we can punish the person by taking out the highest offering.
Yeah.
Right? So it's just the I don't know how to describe. What's the word I'm looking for here for human nature?
I don't know. I think it's mistrusting authority. Maybe I don't know.
Yeah, I don't. Well, part of it is that, but I think it's more. It's this idea that it's this idea of free choice, right? That when someone presents to you the highest possible, or opportunity, right? The human knows that he's free to reject it, and then somehow that's tied in here with this idea that some people do choose to reject it, right? And it's sort of the I don't know, the craziness. That might be a bit too crude, but it's.
But is it so? It's like they're shown. You just have to show the miracles, but it's like, no, I don't want to believe that this person has high authority. Right. So that's why you're saying it's after Jesus does some miracle, or after they see something, that immediately afterwards, people question the authority because they're like, well, I don't want to, I'm choosing not to believe it. Is that?
Yes. Well, yeah. At the bottom, it is a choice not to believe it, right? And it's a choice to reject it. It's actually you could say it's more. I mean, at this point, you don't really have a choice of believing it or not believing it, right? Because the idea is that this is if the divine becomes unhidden, right? Then you don't really have a choice of do you believe or not believe, but you do still have a choice of do you accept or reject. And I think that's what happens here, where it's about rejection, right? And we'll see at the end, obviously, you have the ultimate rejection, which would be the crucifixion.
All right. Very interesting. Very interesting. All right. Let's continue with the parable of the wedding banquet, chapter 22. The parable of the wedding banquet. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. And he sent other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered, and everything is ready, but come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized his slaves, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those invited were not worthy. Go therefore into the main streets, and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' Those slaves went out into the streets, and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot, and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" Okay, hold on. How does this wedding robe tie into the banquet? So is the idea that if you have to have a wedding robe, you have to be given a wedding robe to come to the banquet?
Sorry, what's this about?
When he sees the guy who's without a wedding robe.
Oh, you mean the story about the...
Yeah, and he's like, how did he get in without the wedding robe? So is the idea that they went out and gave a bunch of people the wedding robes, and you could only get into the wedding banquet if you had a wedding robe, and this guy came in who didn't have a wedding robe.
So I think what's happening here is that the initial people he invites is probably Israel or the Pharisees, right, who reject him. And then he sends out to everyone. So that would be the Gentiles also included. This is the commission that's going to happen at the end for everyone. And then the person who comes in without the robe would be the person who hasn't, here we might get a bit technical if we say like deified himself, but we mean the person who hasn't prepared himself, let's say, for the kingdom of heaven. So that would be the person who, well, here there's a lot of different ways you can talk about salvation, but it's the person who hasn't basically attended to his own salvation. So he's unprepared for the kingdom, and that's why.
It's interesting too because it's a king who gives a wedding banquet for his son.
Right. Oh yeah, obviously, and then the son is obviously
and everybody,
Jesus, and everybody coming to the wedding of the son is the idea of coming into the kingdom of Jesus. Right.
And the Pharisees obviously choose, again, as you're talking about, they reject the invitation.
Right, and the idea is that Jesus has that line where he says that you come to the kingdom of heaven only through me, you come to the Father only through me, right? So this is the idea here that, again, it's the reason there is a kingdom of heaven, the reason there is a wedding in the first place is because the son is getting married, right? If the son is not getting married, then there wouldn't be a wedding. So again, it's if Jesus didn't come in the flesh, right, then there wouldn't be a kingdom of heaven. And it's also interesting that it's a wedding because the church fathers talk about the church being the bride of Christ, right? So here we have the kingdom of heaven is Christ, and then his people, which would be the church, right, the followers of Christ. In other words, the Christians, right?
The question about paying taxes. Then the Pharisees went and plotted to entrap him in what he said. So they sent their disciples along with Herodians, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are sincere and teach the way of God in accordance with truth, and show deference to no one, for you do not regard people with partiality. Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why are you putting me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. And then he said to them, "Whose head is this, and whose title?" They answered, "Caesar's." Then he said to them, "Give therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." When they heard this, they were amazed, and they left him and went away. Wasn't there a very similar passage about this earlier, with the coin and the fish, when the disciples come to him and said, "Should we pay taxes or not?" And he says, we give the things that are to Caesar, or something like, and we give the things to God that are to God.
There was something along those lines.
But anyway, to not bother them, go catch the first fish, open the thing, and you'll find a gold coin and offer that as a...
Yes. There was that was a strange story. I think when we read it, we were a bit...
But it's kind of a similar answer to
cryptic. Well, this is the story I was referring to when I said I didn't remember if we had read it or we were about to read it, so it turns out we were about to read it. So this is again the idea that now the Pharisees are coming back and they're going to trap him in a dilemma, which is what he just did to them a couple of lines back, right? So now they're coming over and they're like, okay, we've got a good dilemma for him. We're gonna set him up. And it's kind of the same trap because it's, again, you're either going against the divine or you're going to go against the Romans.
Yeah.
Right? So whilst Jesus set up the trap for them, which was you either go against the divine or you go against the people around me who believe in me. But now they've gone to the Roman Empire. And we see this is basically what happens, that Jesus's strength here in the dialogue comes from his followers, whilst the strength of the Pharisees at the end of the day comes from the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
And again, we see that he knows what he's doing because he gives them the third option, right? He gives them the third option, which gets them out of the dilemma. And then they're amazed because obviously they're not as bright here in terms of rhetoric.
Here we go. I'm sorry. I'm just going to read the previous passage. Um, yeah, here we go. Jesus and the temple tax. This was from 17, verse 24. When they reached Capernaum, the collectors of the tax temple came to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the temple tax?" He said, "Yes, he does." And when he came home, Jesus spoke of it, asking, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of earth take toil or tribute? From their children or from others?" When Peter said from others, Jesus said to him, "Then the children are free. However, so that we do not give offense to them, go to the sea, cast a hook, take the first fish that comes up, and when you open its mouth, you will find a coin. Take that and give it to them for you and me."
Yes, that was an interesting story. I don't remember what we said about it actually.
I think we said it's confusing. But I think we just said that, like, I don't know. You'll have to watch the video to remember what we said. Um,
Clearly, we're gonna have to watch the video.
yeah. Well, you can check it out in the link in the description. Okay. The question about resurrection. This seems like a big one. The same day, how do you say this? Sadducees. The same day the Sadducees came to him, saying, "There is no resurrection." And they asked him a question. "Teacher," Moses said, "if a man dies childless, his brother shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died childless, leaving the widow to his brother. The second did the same, so also the third down to the 7th. Last of all, the woman herself died. In the resurrection, then, whose wife of the 7 will she be? For all of them had married her." Jesus answered them, "You are wrong, because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection people neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels of God in heaven, And as for the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was said to you by God? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is God and not of the dead, but of the living." And when the crowds heard it, they were astounded at his teaching. The greatest commandment. When the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, an expert in the law, asked him a question to test him. "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" He said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the laws and the prophets." Hang all the law and the prophets. Okay, I'll just read this next one.
Yeah.
About it. The question about David's son. Now, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them this question: "What do you think of the Messiah? Whose son is he?" They said to him, "The son of David." He said to them, How is it then that David by the Spirit calls him Lord, saying, 'The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand, until I put your enemies under your feet'? If David thus calls him Lord, how can he be his son?" No one was able to give him an answer, nor from that day did anyone dare to ask him any more questions.
Okay. So yeah, this is Jesus just going after them again.
Yeah. What do you make of the resurrection?
So this we have this idea about the resurrection where people come back to life, and there's this idea that then it's not of the dead, it's of the living. So you have to like reconceive your notion of the afterlife, right? Because it's not about being dead, it's actually being alive. Which I think is interesting, because even when we talk about the afterlife and people who believe in the afterlife, obviously we still use this term afterlife, which makes it sound like, well, not life, right? But it's a continuation of life, but it's like a better life. So I think that's like an interesting way of reconceiving the notion of what's going to happen at the resurrection.
There's two parts I want to ask you about because so the first is obviously they bring up Old Testament scripture, and they say Moses said, if a man dies childless, his brother shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. And then they said, in the resurrection, then whose wife, and basically, so the widow goes to the next brother
Yes.
of those who die. And then the question is, okay, but then in the resurrection, who gets to be with the widow? Is it the first one or the last one or any of the in between? And Jesus kind of says, "Oh, you guys have it wrong, right?" He says in the resurrection, there's people don't marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels of God in heaven. And that part is really interesting to me because this is one of the, at least by my recollection, like he's giving kind of a specific account of what heaven is like.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he's saying, oh, all of the stuff that happens in, I don't want to call it the real world, but you know what I mean? Like before you get resurrected, before you die.
This world.
This world. It's not what you think. Like you don't just repeat this world in heaven. You're like angels. And so it opens the door to a much more I guess abstract. I don't mean abstract in terms of like it's funky and whatever, but I mean in terms of like different things that we haven't quite comprehended or that we don't have a clear vision of in this world.
Yeah, I think you're right on that.
And I think it's very interesting because like one of the things I think about a lot, or that people ask me, so what do you think like the afterlife is like? You know, what do you think heaven is, right? And from this, it kind of seems like, oh, maybe the right answer is we're not like supposed to really know, right? Or there's nothing that you can like say, oh, and I think this is maybe what separates Christianity from some other religions, where like, I'm no expert in Islam, but I know that like when you die, right? If you're good, you're supposed to get 72, 73 virgins or something like that.
I'm not an expert on this.
It's something like that. There's like a fixed thing, but here it's like, again, I'm not an Islamic scholar. Do not quote me on that. I could be totally wrong, but this is this like abstract notion of what heaven is, and I think that's really interesting.
So I think you're right, and I think you're right, especially on the point that this is actually not about us getting knowledge about heaven. And I think there is a lot of things in Christianity which are left up to mystery, and the exact nature of heaven is one of them. And at first reading, you might be thinking this passage is going to tell us something about heaven, but I think it's more to do with, again, this idea between the Mosaic tradition, the Mosaic tradition, and about what was left from the Old Testament and how we're going to move into the New Testament. Because again, we're talking about here, the law here that Moses is talking about is to do with practical matters. It's to do with this world, right? In other words, whilst they're also asking a question about heaven, and the question now is appropriate because, again, like you said, abstract, maybe I would call it idyllic, right? We're talking about the ideal world here, and the practical matters are no longer applicable to that ideal world. So actually what Jesus responds, in essence, is that the question has lost its meaning, because the question has to do with this world. It's got to do with practical matters. It doesn't have to do with heaven. And marriage itself is also, again, marriage is a sacrament that occurs on this world, right? It's in the church, and it's part of the sacraments like baptism, for example. And obviously in the kingdom of God, like we could ask, well, would baptism occur in the kingdom of God? Well, presumably no, right? Because this is a sacrament that's to do with our current situation, and then once we get to the kingdom of God, then people would either experience it as heaven, right, or it would be hell. So I think that's the idea here, that I think you touched on exactly what the idea is, which is basically this is more about the transition from the practical this world to the idyllic next world, and how that transition is to be attained, and what it means to be attained, and how many things we need to reprioritize, because it turns out, and the reason why we need to reprioritize them, and why this was right in the past and it's no longer right by the time of Jesus, is of course because he's about to be crucified and then resurrected, and he's going to restore the human nature. So that's why the whole story is going to undergo a change at this point. And that's why he's talking about this and saying that you don't understand, because things are going to now be more about the, as you said, abstract, but it's more about the ideal situation.
So
Yeah.
so then, given what we just said, what do you then make of the next part? As for the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was said to you by God? I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is God not of the dead, but of the living.
So this is what I mentioned again. This is part of, it's a reconception. That's what he's doing here. He's saying we should reconceive all our notions that we've had before, because things are about to change, right? So the resurrection is to do with the restoration of humanity, and that will have this effect that when we are considering the afterlife, it's to do with life. It's not to do with death. And I think we still conceive of the afterlife as to do with death, because we're still really only thinking about the death part. If we're being honest, right? A lot of people, that's how they conceive it, because you have life, then you have death, and then the afterlife is, well, afterlife, right? It doesn't quite sound like great life, but
So when he says resurrection of the dead, and then he says, have you not read, he is God not of the dead, but of the living, he's kind of saying, like, stop thinking about it as like, you know, you this is the phase of life when you're dead.
yeah,
You know, this is still living, just in a different capacity.
right. Well, in a better capacity.
Better capacity.
Well, for some. Put it that way, but
Yeah, well. Interesting. Okay.
are we gonna mention something about the commandments? The greatest commandment?
To love God with all your heart.
Yeah, so it's interesting that a lot of people know about the second one, which is to do with reciprocity, right? It's to do with being treated the same way you want other people to treat you. But we again see this thing that it's that second commandment loses its force if we don't have the first commandment, which is to do with God and there being a hierarchy of value, right? So when people say, like, for example, I know that Confucius, for instance, has a similar dictum where he talks about, it's actually, I think it's in the negative, so where he says, like, don't treat other people the way that you don't want to be treated, right?
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say, like, but here we have this addition that the first thing we need to know is that there is a God, and that there is a divine, and that's why the second commandment actually has force behind it, right? It's a divine force, and this mirrors again, obviously, the commandments that we have from the Old Testament, because there the first commandment is the same.
What is your translation? Because mine says, "You shall love your God with all your heart." Does yours also say your God?
Yes, love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind.
Do you think there's any significance behind that, like, phrase, your God? Because why doesn't he just say love God?
Well, I'm not aware of any specific significance, but you can certainly read something into it. I mean, it's your God, like, the Father, your Father, like the one who has created you. So that's what I presume is the significance.
Yeah. I just wonder, because I feel like including that personal pronoun there potentially could open the door, I don't know, for a more like personalized reading of, or a personalized connection with God. Like, meaning, as opposed to just everybody reaches God through this way, and this is the way that everybody does it. Adding that your could potentially open the door for like each person has a different path toward the reaching the divine and reaching God, and there is personalized individual ways to get there. I don't know if that's reading too much into it.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's exactly about personalized ways of getting there, but it is about this familiarity with the object of love, which I think is part of it, right? Because there is this idea that in order to love something, then you need to know it. Right? You need to know something about it, so you need to know God on a personal level, and that's why it's your God, right? And I don't know. To me, it reads more like a familial relation. You'd say like love your child or love your father, right?
Yeah.
So that maybe that's why it's there.
Okay. This is a long passage. 23. Jesus denounces scribes and Pharisees. All right, bear with us. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it, but do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach. They tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them onto the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. They love to have their place of honor at banquets and the best seats in the synagogues, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have people call them Rabbi. But you are not to be called Rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers and sisters, and no one your father on earth. For you have one Father, and the one in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. All who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you lock people out of the kingdom of heaven, for you do not go in yourselves, and when others are going in, you stop them. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you cross sea and land to make a single convert, and you make the new convert twice as much a child of hell as yourselves. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, "Whoever swears by the sanctuary is bound by nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the sanctuary is bound by the oath." You blind fools, for which is greater, the gold of the sanctuary that has made the gold sacred? And you say, "Whoever swears by the altar is bound by nothing, but whoever swears by the gift that is on the altar is bound by the oath." How blind are you? For which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? So whoever swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it, and whoever swears by the sanctuary swears by it and by the one who dwells in it, and whoever swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by the one who is seated upon it. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, for the teeth, mint, dill, and cumin have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others. You blind guides, you strain out of a gnat, but swallow a camel. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and of the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and of the plate, so that the outside also may become clean. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside look beautiful, but inside are full of bones of the dead and of all kinds of uncleanliness. So you are also on the outside look righteous to others, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build tombs of the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. And you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Thus you testify against yourselves that you are the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up the measure of your ancestors. You snakes, you brood of vipers, how can you escape the judgment of hell? For this reason I send you prophets, sages, and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, some you will flog in your synagogues, and pursue from town to town, so that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Barachiah, who you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I tell you, all this will come upon this generation. The lament of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are all sent to it. How often I have decided to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her brood under her wings. You were not willing. See, your house is left to you, for I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Whew.
Yeah, that's a doozy to get through.
By the way, the word in the beginning, what was it?
The phylacteries.
Phylacteries. I have no idea what that means.
Yeah. I don't know either. I think I've heard it somewhere, but I clearly don't use it enough to know what it means. Okay, well, there's a lot to get through here. Right at the beginning, we have this interesting verse where he talks about the role of tradition again, and he says that you must obey them because they sit in Moses' seat, but you should not imitate them. Right. So I think this is like an interesting idea where there's this, he's been trying to keep this balance, and this is what I've maintained throughout our talks about the Matthew Gospel, is that he's trying to keep this balance between the having respect for the tradition and obviously talking about all the good things that come from it, but then because of the change and also because they're not really living up to the tradition that they're espousing, right? So that's why I think it's an oversimplification to say that Jesus is against tradition as a whole, and he just says you should figure things out completely on your own, because I don't think that's what he is saying. And like we said before, a lot of the times he refutes the Pharisees by quoting tradition. Right. And the whole first gospel here of Matthew is to do with tradition, right? So I don't think that's the right reading. And this, again, you see right before he goes into this big condemnation of the Pharisees, right? And what they have done with the tradition. He sets this up as it's not the problem of the tradition, it's the problem of the Pharisees, right? So he sets it up right off on the outset, and then he goes into talking about their problems. And I think the main thing that he talks about is exactly, it's in an individual, it's the fact that, yes, they're doing the things that tradition says, but they're not doing them for the right reasons, right? So it's to do with exaltation of themselves, and it's not to do with humbling. And this is another thing that I think a lot of people, when they read this, they're like, oh, so he's saying that there's no points of authority, right? Nobody can have authority. But that's not really what he's saying, because what he's saying is the problem is that the people who have authority at that time are the people who they're in love with their authority and they're exalting themselves and they like being called rabbi, right? But they're not humbling themselves. So he's not saying that people are not higher, because a lot of the times he does say that, even when he talks about children, right? He says because the children are humble, then he's like they have a higher place, right? When he talks about their innocence. So obviously there's a hierarchy here of divinity, right? And some people are more humble and some people are better in that sense than others. But here what he's saying is the problem is not the hierarchy. The problem is why they think they're higher than other people, right? they are in love with their statute, right? So it's not to do with the kingdom of heaven anymore. It's actually to do with the kingdom of earth, because they've come down to our kingdom and now they're talking about being higher up in our world, which, as we see, Jesus multiple times says is not the equivalent of being higher up in the next world, right?
Mm-hmm. So is this kind of why he says, when they says, for you clean the outside of the cup, but inside they're full of greed and self-indulgence? Is this like, that they're in love with the idea of showing, the shiny cup and the plate, right? They're in love with their authority and acting like they're doing all these traditions and that they have such this authority. But if you look on the inside, you look at like what the truth is, they're not doing any of these things.
Exactly, yes. So the main thing he's accusing them of throughout the whole gospel is hypocrisy. And again, like I said, hypocrisy can only be maintained if they're saying something right and then they're doing something wrong. So that means they have to be saying something right in the first place, right? And that would be the tradition. Now, I'm not saying that the whole tradition that's been passed down has to be accepted, because it's accepted, but also the idea here is that it prophesies the change that's going to occur once the resurrection occurs, right? So that's the changes to the actual tradition that occur are supposed to be at the same time continuous with the tradition, right? But here he's saying that their problem is different. Their problem is that they're being hypocritical, so they're not even maintaining the tradition which they claim to be maintaining. And yes, it will be equivalent to it's not about rejecting the whole cup, right? It's about filling it with the correct liquid, right? That's the idea. And they're hollow, right? They haven't really they haven't really filled themselves up with the divine, let's put it that way.
And it's just kind of a similar line when he says, for whoever swears by the altar is bound by nothing, but whoever swears by the gift that is on the altar is bound by the oath. For which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred?
Sacred, yeah.
Whoever swears by the altar swears by it and everything on it.
So again, we have this idea of reconceptualizing and reprioritizing. That's his main focus here, is that everything is basically everything's been turned upside down, and he's coming and saying, well, what the priority is, it's I don't remember if this was a metaphor in the Bible, but it's the fount of the water, right? It's where it's the source of the water. That's what's good, and not that which you clean with the water. And let's put it another way. That's another metaphor. So it's not about the thing that is sacred is the thing that's obviously it's the thing that carries sacredness with it. It's intrinsic to it, and it's not the things that become sacred in virtue of it, right?
So how does that relate to the altar thing?
So it's the altar. That's where it is, and then obviously once you look towards the altar, you also look towards the divine, right? So he's asking us to pull back.
So he's saying it's the altar that's sacred, and not necessarily the gift.
Right, exactly, yeah. Because he talks about the gold here, and he says, "Woe to you, blind guides! You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But if anyone swears by the gold of the temple, he is bound by his oath." So that's what they say.
Right.
And then he says, "You blind fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred?"
Right.
Right, and that's what I mean. That it's again we have this prioritization of the place where the right things happen, right? The temple and again this actually refers back to when he was getting angry with the money changers, right? Because we have this idea that you have the gold and you have all these things which are supposed to point you to the direction of the divine, right? It's like we put them there so we know that this is a sacred place, but they're not the things that are sacred, right? They're only sacred in virtue of the place and at the end of the day in virtue of the divine which is present there.
That's interesting.
So again, I think it's about reprioritizing what we value. And then towards the end, we have this idea where, which I think is very interesting as well, where he talks about how he will continue sending righteous people, basically, and you will continue to kill them.
That's interesting.
Right, and you will continue to do so. So it's kind of like you get what you want.
That's
right?
very interesting.
Yeah, it is very interesting, and it's this idea that it's like be careful what you wish for, but like in the extreme sense, because it's you want this, but he's basically threatening them with it by saying, well, you're gonna have it, but it doesn't sound good for them, right? Obviously, if you read it at first, you're thinking, well, this doesn't seem very good. I mean, the good people are gonna be getting killed, and then the bad people are the ones doing the killing, right? So it seems like they're winning out, but obviously, the underlying message is they're continually losing.
Right.
That's the problem. And then that's the whole idea that it's not to do with this world, it's to do with the next world. And this is actually, I think, related to an Exodus where we talk about the Pharaoh and his heart being hardened. It's this idea that God kind of allows people to exercise their free will even when it's really bad, right? Just as he does when it's really good.
Yeah.
So he's allowing them to exercise it, and he's giving them, well, the means in terms of like we're in this world with each other, right? So he's giving them the means to do it, and then you basically get what you want at the end. But the problem is the entire time, he's basically saying you shouldn't want that. So it's not like they're not achieving what they want. Like obviously, the bad people are achieving what they want, but the problem is that it's not the best thing that you could want.
Yeah.
So they're actually getting a pretty bad deal here, but in their mind, they're getting a good deal.
I love just this lament over Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stone that are sent to it. Basically talking about like how, Jerusalem is like a cursed city. I don't know. I just think it's funny, not funny, but to think about like if you look at history and the amount of bloodshed that has been gone on because of Jerusalem, I think it's this particular passage is quite prophetic in that sense.
Yeah, and it's interesting that it has been placed at such high regards, considering here he basically says that it is abandoned. And again, we need to talk about, obviously, again, omnipresence is not negated by these ideas. It's that the divine is hyper-present in some areas, right? And obviously we know from the tradition that in Jerusalem, it's hyper-present. But now we see that it's no longer going to be hyper-present there. And that's what he sees here, because he says, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Right? So that would be referring to himself, I presume. So the idea here is that, and this later on, Paul talks about this in his letters again, to do with the question of what is the Jewish relation now to God, right? What's the relation? And basically the answer is the relation is through Jesus,
right?
Like for everyone else.
It's not through a city, through a place.
Right. It's been abandoned. You've now been invited to the wedding, right? And the wedding is between the church and Christ, the church that's established by Christ, right? So it's no longer just the city. It's not Jerusalem is not the one who's getting married to the Son, right? It's the church of Christ. So that's what happens here at the end.
Could you imagine what better place we'd be in today if more people embraced that?
Which one? The whole thing?
Well, yes, but I just mean specifically the Jerusalem stuff.
Yeah, well, like I said, from a historical point of view, it is interesting.
But even, not to bring this to what's happening today, but
No, yeah, it has a that's what I mentioned. It's interesting the importance that's placed on the city and why it's placed there.
yeah. Okay. The destruction of the temple foretold. Chapter 24. As Jesus came out of the temple and was going away, his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. Then he asked them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I tell you, not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." Signs of the end of the age. When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Jesus answered them, "Beware that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Messiah,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of many wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nations will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All this is but the beginning of the birth pangs." I don't know what pangs means.
It's like before giving birth.
Oh, okay.
Like women have like contractions, basically.
Persecutions foretold. Then they will hand you over to be tortured and will put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. Then many will fall away, and they will betray one another and hate one another, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because of the increase of lawlessness, the love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the world as a testimony to all the nations, and the end will come. The desolating sacrilege. So when you see the desolating sacrilege spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. The one on the housetop must not go down to take things from the house. The one in the field must not turn back to get a coat. Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for at that time there will be great suffering, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no one will be saved. For the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, "Look, here is the Messiah," or "There is he," do not believe it, for false messiahs and false prophets will appear and produce great signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Take note, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, "Look, he is in the wilderness," do not go out. If they say, "Look, he is in the inner rooms," do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the eagles will gather. The coming of the Son of Man. Immediately after the suffering of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. The lesson of the fig tree. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender, and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So, also when you see all these things, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away.
Okay. Where do we begin? So this is the part of the basis of eschatology, which is the study of the end times and what's going to happen in the
Eschatology.
Yes.
Yeah.
And well, it's interesting because we have a lot of things here about. There's this idea, first of all, that a lot of the early disciples and followers of Jesus believed that this would happen in their lifetime.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because he does say at the end there, you will not pass away. But of course, up until now, we have been talking about this idea of death being strange because the afterlife is one of the living. Right? So if we read it in context, that line there is not as straightforward as it seems. It does not seem to just be saying, you will not die before this happens, in my opinion anyway. There are disagreements on this, of course. But it seems to me like what we've been talking about so far has been about reconceptualizing and reprioritizing and him thinking differently about the afterlife and how the afterlife is still alive. Right? So when he says that they're not going to pass away, there is this sort of underlying idea here. Well, what does that mean? Because there is this idea that we're still going to be alive, right? So that's one thing. And also, he begins by saying there's going to be lots of wars and lots of false prophets. Nations will be rising and falling. I don't see how that can happen in their lifetime, right? I mean, that seems like a lot of events that are supposed to happen. So that's some signs there that I don't think this is some sort of false saying. Like, I don't think... because some people would directly just say, well, okay, clearly this is false. Like, he's saying this is all going to occur. It didn't occur. But I don't think that's so straightforward.
You think he's talking about it more in the sense of, like, this is going to happen
later, right?
This is going to happen throughout history.
Exactly. Well, yeah, history since his death.
Since his death. That's the way I've always seen it, too.
There is a lot of different theories on it, but that's to me it seems like that just follows from the way we've read it so far. But there's of course people who can.
But then, how do you make sense of coming back on the third day?
What do you mean?
Well, isn't it all supposed to?
Oh, that refers to the resurrection. You mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that would be another way of reading it. So that's why I'm saying there's like different ways of reading it, and technically they're not. Well, I would say still though, we're talking about here when he talks about the rise and fall of the nations. Obviously, that doesn't happen by the time he is resurrected. So you could read it as him saying, as him changing here from two different things. First talking about the end times, and then he like shifts to talking about when he's going to come in his glory, which would be the resurrection, and that would happen in their lifetime. So that could also be another reading you can do, yeah.
Or do you think it could also be where we're talking about the death and resurrection, but then we're also talking about the period from the resurrection to the second coming?
Right, so that's what I'm saying. It's and also that is not there's another way we could look at it, is also that is a repeating thing. So we have like a microcosm, and then we have the macrocosm. So the microcosm would be what's going to happen with them, which is things are going to get really bad, which is about to happen, right, in the story, and then he's going to come in all his glory. And then that could also be expanded to the macrocosm, which would be the end of our history, right? So it's not just the end of their story, but it's the end of our story.
Right.
So, yes, exactly. So I think maybe the ambiguity is meant to be because the meaning is two-layered, right?
Mm.
So it's meant to be, you're reading it for them, but you're also reading it for yourself.
Yeah.
Because he does, again, he talks about like my words will never pass away, right? So there's these things where he's referring obviously to events after his death and resurrection, but also it seems to be foreshadowing his death and resurrection, right?
And I think the foreshadowing is kind of highlighted in this lesson from the fig tree passage where he says, the fig tree learned its lessons. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, foreshadowing that summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you know that here he is near at the very gates.
Mm-hmm.
So again, same way that the fig tree foreshadows summer is coming. These things happening foreshadow. Or were you talking about him foreshadowing that these events will occur in the future?
Yes, I think that's part of it as well. But again, I said it's interesting because you can read it in both ways, right? Because he talks about things will become worse, and he says that it will become worse, but not only in terms of like the suffering and the circumstances, but also in terms of that it will be a direct threat to people's salvation, right? And now that's a bit peculiar because you might be thinking, well, salvation is dependent on your personal choice, right? So what circumstances would threaten that? But obviously we know that there's a lot of circumstances in the world that can threaten your personal choices, because when you're pushed, a lot of people will change their mind, right? Because that's again that strange thing about human freedom, where it's like, well, we know we can change it, so why should you stay the same, right? So if you're getting pushed on something, it's a lot easier, I think, a human tendency actually to just decide to choose the opposite, right? And that's why he says the time will be cut short so that not everybody leaves, right? Because it seems like the human nature just is to change their, to not stay, to not sustain their belief, right?
Yeah.
So you could read that as the moment before the resurrection, where the disciples have this moment of like, do they stick up with Jesus, like we'll see with Peter, or do they not? Or you could read this as the second coming and what's going to happen then, and then the final age of people, will they stick with Jesus or not, right?
Yeah. For sure. Yeah. This is like, it's side note, I am reminded of when he's describing all of this, it reminds me of you read what's the Bulgakov story?
Which one?
With Bulgakov with the devil and
The Master and Margarita.
Master Margarita. It reminds me of when they're describing the devil is describing these events happening. And yeah, exactly like this is happening in the book. I don't know why, it just reminded me of that.
That's a great book, by the way. If anybody's interested in theology and philosophy, definitely read that.
Yeah. Anyway, that was partly a ploy to buy me some time some breath before I read this next part. But okay. The necessity for watchfulness. But about that day and hour no one knows, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. For as the days of Noah were, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day Noah entered the ark, and they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them all away. So too will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then 2 will be in the field, 1 will be taken, and 1 will be left. 2 women will be grinding meal together, 1 will be taken, and 1 will be left. Keep away, therefore, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But understand this: if the owner of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake, and would not have let his house be broken into. And therefore you must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour you do not expect. The faithful or the unfaithful slave? Who then is the faithful and wise slave whom his master has put in charge of his household to give the other slaves their allowance of food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master will find at work when he arrives. Truly I tell you, he will put that one in charge of all his possessions. But if that wicked slave says to himself, "My master is delayed," and begins to beat his fellow slaves, and eats and drinks with his drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour that he does not know. He will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So this is interesting because both of these passages just highlight that what's interesting is, so before it's kind of saying like, oh, you're gonna, all these things foreshadow it's coming.
Yep.
Right? And then here it's like,
this is how it will happen.
Be constantly, well, but this part, the need for watchfulness in the faithful and unfaithful slave parable is like, you cannot, do all these bad things, but then like put on the performance for when you think it's going to happen. Because it's going to happen when you least expect it. So prepare yourselves at all times.
So, yeah, this reminds me of the philosopher Montaigne. He talks about how if you want to act well, in one of his essays, he says that you should imagine that there's always some being that's watching you. Right? And he says that's because he wasn't particularly religious, but he thought that that's one of the benefits of the religious psyche, is that this idea that you're always thinking that there's an external factor which is judging you. And it's interesting because, in a sense, there is, because, people have a conscience, right? And it's always telling them what they should do and what they shouldn't do, right? But it's interesting, actually, most of the time it tells them what they shouldn't do. But but it's interesting because the way you can ignore it is by saying, well, that's part of me, and then I'm up and against it, right? So I can decide what to do. But if you actually extract it out and you say it's like another person, like you imagine it's someone else watching you do it, right, and they're judging you on it, and then you're like, oh, well, wait a second, like it suddenly feels much more bad when you do it, right? And I think that's just because it's more practical, right? It's a practical method.
With the Montaigne reference, you just reminded me of Santa Claus.
Okay, how is this gonna go?
Because it's like, he sees you when you're sleeping.
Okay, yeah.
He knows when you're awake. He knows if you've been bad or good. So be good for goodness sake.
Yeah, I could have gone with the Santa reference, but I chose the Montaigne one just for the matter.
You bring the sophistication, and I'm bringing the lowering it. No, but it's
the same idea.
Yeah,
exactly.
You have this constant.
And who is that for? It's obviously for the children. And why is it there? To make them behave well, right? So it's exactly the same idea here. He's saying we should behave well because you never know when the second coming will come. And it's very practical in terms of actually getting people to think about who they want to be when they're going to be judged in the ultimate sense of the word, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So, are we continuing here?
Sure. We've got Parable of 10 Bridesmaids.
We could take a break if you want.
You want to take a break at 26? The plot to kill Jesus.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. The Parable of the 10 Bridesmaids. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like this. 10 young women took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish, and 5 were wise. When the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them, but the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. As the bridegroom was delayed, all of them became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a shout, "Look, here is the bridegroom, come out to meet him." Then all those young women got up and trimmed their lamps. the foolish said to the wise, 'Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out.' But the wise replied, 'No, there will not be enough for you and for us. You had better go to the dealers and buy some for yourselves.' But when they went to buy it, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready with him into the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. And those who were ready went with him into the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later the other young woman came, also saying, 'Lord, Lord, open to us.' But he replied, 'Truly I tell you, I do not know you. Keep awake, and therefore you know neither the day nor the hour.'" The parable of the talents. For it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. At once the one who had received the 5 talents went off and traded with them, and made 5 more talents. In the same way the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. But the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. After a long time the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, 'Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. See, I have made 5 more talents.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master.' As the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, 'Master, you handed over to me 2 talents. See, I have made 2 more talents.' His master said to him, 'Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master.' Then the one who received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, 'Master, I knew you were a harsh man, reaping what you did not sow, and gathering what you did not scatter. So I was afraid, and went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours.' But his master replied, 'You wicked and lazy slave, you knew, did you, that I reap where I did not sow, and gather what I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him, and give it to the one with the 10 talents. For to all those who have, more will be given, and those who have in abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be gnashing of teeth." The judgment of the nations. When the Son of Man comes into the glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand, and the goats at his left. Then the king will say to those at the right hand, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. And I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me, and I was in prison, and you visited me.' Then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick and in prison and visited you?' And the king will answer them, 'Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it to me.' Then he will say to those at his left hand, 'You who are cursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not give me clothing. Sick and in prison, and you did not visit me.' Then they will also answer me, 'Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not take care of you?' Then he will answer them, "Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into the eternal fire." I could have sworn we read something similar, like almost verbatim, in an earlier passage.
Well, maybe it was quite long ago if we did. I don't remember.
Like the one about when were you hungry and I did not give you food? And then he says, just as you did not do it to the least of you, you did not do it unto me.
There might have been. There was a lot of parables.
I'm getting
that went
deja
through.
vu from this one.
So, for me, the first one is probably the best one in terms of interesting things, because we have the two things that I noted. First of all, we have this idea of salvation is related to preparation. So just like when we were talking about the marriage and the person coming in there being unprepared, like when he was not dressed properly. And now here we have this idea of the oil, right? So again, it's related to you being saved is related to you being prepared to be saved, right? And what this preparation involves, right, is the basis of a lot of debate and discussion about works versus faith and this idea of soteriology, right? How we're to become saved. But it's interesting to me that it's always related to an actual action, right? Like a preparing yourself. So it seems to me like this involves in some ways some sort of works, right? So that's what I would read it as. It's not just about, having faith, but it also involves about preparing yourself in a certain way, like being dressed properly when you go into the wedding, or bringing what's needed at the time, right?
I see. So this is a lot like the don't try to predict when it's going to happen, and only do it when you think it's going to happen.
Yeah, it's about always being prepared, right?
Because these foolish women are like, oh, we don't need to care about it because they don't take oil with them, and they don't think about it.
Right, and then when he does come, they are willing to go with him, but the problem is they're not prepared to go with him. Right? Because it's not like they don't want to, right? They desperately want to go, but the problem is they've been neglecting their duties, right? And again, it's like neglecting their duties towards what? Well, we see that at the end when they show up and he says, "I don't know you." Right? So they're neglecting their duties to know God, right? To know the divine. That's what's being neglected by them. Right. So he actually goes a little bit out of the story here at the end, because at first it's about the oil and the candles and all that, and then when he gets to the end, he says like, no, the actual problem is like you don't know him. That's the problem.
Right.
So here he's going out of the parable, because obviously in the parable the other 5 women would also not know him because they just met him, but obviously the idea is that the preparation is getting to know him, right? In the real world. So that's what I think is interesting here, that it does involve something like where you need to be prepared. It's not just about when he comes, you're like, oh yes, I want to go. It's like, well, yes, but if you really, put it into it, you would have prepared yourself, right?
Yeah. Also, just side note, outside of the theological stuff, I think this is good advice generally in life. It's like, if you only do, put forward your best work or try at something when you think it's going to count, usually I find that it ends up happening that the thing that you need to be prepared for, or the thing that you should care about, you're like actually not prepared for when it happens. But if you always prepare yourself, then like even if you think that nobody's watching or nobody cares, in reality somebody is noticing and like treats you better because of it. Just something I've noticed. It's something that my dad always says. It's like you never know who's paying attention, who's in the room. Always like,
Put your best
put
foot
your best
forward,
foot
right?
forward in all circumstances because you never know who's paying attention, who's noticing you, who's in the room, who could, help you down the line.
So basically, always prepare like it's the last time you're gonna prepare, right?
Yeah.
Like it's the last judgment.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I would say a lot of these parables can be read without the theological idea, but it's obviously there.
Yeah. I mean, I had a teacher in high school who he was profound atheist, but he was like a huge Jesus fan.
Mm-hmm.
Because he was like, the way he was reading it was, what Jesus was doing was he was teaching us how to live.
Yeah.
He was teaching us, giving us the keys for how to live, a better life, to live the best life. But all of the like he was complete atheist and thought that when we die, nothing, it's just the end and there is no God. But it was, yeah, he like basically took all of the Gospels and was like lived by it and super into it, but none of the theological stuff.
Yeah, and I would say a lot of people do obviously say that Jesus is like a good moral teacher, and you could look at him as someone like the Buddha, right? Someone who is like a philosopher of ethics, if we said it like a modern day kind of description.
Yeah.
But I think the key takeaway from the theology side is that for him it's not enough, right? So he's saying that you need to believe, as we said with the commandments, right? So you need to believe in what he's saying. You need to believe in this reality, this metaphysical reality that he's describing, because for him that's the basis for what he is saying. And without it, he's saying that wouldn't be the same, right?
Yeah.
You could say it, but the words would not be as full as they are now. And this also goes to like C.S. Lewis's famous trilemma, where he says you only have three options if you actually analyze the historical Jesus Christ, right? You can either say that he was a good moral teacher and he was saying true theological things, so he was actually divine and like all this. Obviously, there's a debate about interpretation, but if we agree on that's the interpretation, then you either go with that side, which is obviously the religious side, or you're going to have to say that he wasn't a good teacher, or that he was a bad person, right?
Yeah.
Because he would have been lying when he was saying all these things. So actually, it would be very strange because he would be like the Buddha, but with a bunch of lies connected to him, right? Where he didn't need to say those things.
Yeah.
He could have just given his moral opinions on things.
By the way, I think now thinking about it more, I think these two next like the parable of the tenants and the judgment of nations,
Yes.
is basically saying the same thing. Because I think that the talents is like, right, the problem with the last guy is he's thinking that the master is gonna get mad at him. Right, he says something. Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping what you did not sow, and gathering what you did not scatter. So I was afraid and went and hid your talents in the ground.
Right, and again we have this idea of not preparing, right? He's not doing anything with it. He's just saying idly by, waiting for the return, whilst the others are actually doing something with their life, right? Before he gets there.
And then the judgment of nations, right? He says, "Oh, the people are like." In response to him saying, I was hungry and you did not give me food. I was thirsty and you did not give me drink. They're like, oh, what? What are you talking about? What do you mean we didn't do this? And he's like, yeah, but you didn't do it to the least of the people. Right?
Yeah, you're right. And it's exactly the same thing where the problem is they don't know him.
Right.
So again, it's like, and you see that because they question it. They're like, well, how didn't we help you? Because again, it's like waiting for, I'll be good on that day where it matters.
Right.
But it's like, but every day matters.
Of course, if you come, then we'll give you food. And it's like, no,
Right, right.
but you you didn't do it in all of these instances. So you didn't actually do it.
And the exact same thing happens with the story of the the previous story there where he says that you don't know me, like,
Yeah.
or he says if you knew all these things, then you would know to behave properly, but you didn't behave properly, right?
Right.
So you actually didn't know, you did not know what was expected of you. That's the basic message here.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Okay. We've come to 26. We've got 3 more chapters. Obviously, they're very weighty ones. So I say we take a small break and come back and do 26, 27, and 28.
Okay.
All right. Thank you guys for listening to part 1. Part 2 will be up very shortly. But yeah, thanks for listening. Like and subscribe. And check out the previous gospel episodes. Here or here. I don't know which. But yeah, see you very soon.